In today's story, a powerful CEO's daughter breaks all the corporate rules, bringing an unexpected guest into a high-stakes business meeting. The man she invites is no executive, he's just a security guard. But when he speaks up, the room is left in shock. His insights on financial strategy not only challenge the board's assumptions, but could change the future of the entire company. Watch as this story unfolds, proving that talent can come from the most unexpected places. Stay tuned for a lesson in breaking stereotypes, seeing potential, and the true meaning of leadership. The high-rise conference room of Hanley Enterprises had always been the battleground for the city's most influential executives, a place where financial power met corporate ambition. This room had witnessed the sharpest minds clash over strategies, the deepest pockets negotiate billion-dollar deals, and the most polished suits making life-changing decisions. Today was no different. The air felt thick with anticipation as the room was filled with the usual corporate faces, men and women dressed in tailored suits, their ties sharp, their expressions stern. The meeting was set to decide the company's future direction. Every seat at the long, glass-topped table was occupied by a member of the board, including the CEO, Mrs. Elena Harrington, whose unwavering reputation for decisiveness and elegance had made her a formidable force in the business world. As the clock ticked closer to the start of the meeting, the quiet murmur of hushed conversations echoed through the room. This was, after all, a meeting that could determine not only profits, but the strategic direction for years to come. Then, just as the final moments of silence hovered before the meeting began, the door to the conference room swung open with a soft creak. All eyes in the room turned toward the entrance. The first person to enter was a woman, tall and composed, her presence unmistakable. The sharp click of her heels against the marble floor seemed to command the attention of the room, almost like the beginning of a dramatic play. Sophia Reynolds was the sole heir to Hanley Enterprises, a company that her late father had founded. She was a woman who carried the weight of her family legacy on her shoulders, and despite her youthful appearance, she had earned the respect of everyone in the room through her sharp business acumen. Today, however, it was not just her entrance that caught everyone's attention. It was the man who followed her in. Sophia walked to the head of the table, her stride confident and poised, every step a testament to years of experience navigating the cutthroat world of business. But behind her, something was off. The man trailing just a few paces behind her was dressed in something that didn't belong in this room. A janitor's uniform, worn and slightly faded, his name tag reading Daniel. His hands were clasped around a cleaning rag, and the janitor's mop bucket trailed behind him on wheels. There was a collective pause. The room, which had been murmuring with quiet energy just moments before, was suddenly consumed by a thick silence. Every executive turned their heads slightly, their eyes narrowing as they tried to understand what was happening. A janitor, in this room. And not just in any room, but in the very heart of the business empire that Sophia Reynolds had inherited. The room seemed to freeze in confusion. Sophia moved to her seat at the head of the table, unfazed by the looks and silent questions floating around the room. Her eyes briefly scanned the executives before she settled into her chair, but it wasn't until she placed her briefcase on the table and gestured for Daniel to stand near her that the full weight of the situation sank in. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm, yet firm. The sharpness of her tone carried the weight of years of experience. The executives, still unsure how to respond, remained silent. No one dared ask what this man, a janitor, was doing in their presence. Sophia continued, raising her hand slightly, signaling for silence. "I've brought someone important to today's meeting," She paused, letting the words linger in the air, making sure they were heard by everyone in the room. "This is Daniel," she said, nodding in his direction. The room went even quieter if that was possible. The CFO, Lawrence Whitman, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His gaze darted between Sophia and Daniel, his expression a mixture of confusion and skepticism. After a few moments, Lawrence cleared his throat, trying to regain some control over the situation. He forced a polite smile, although it was clear that his patience was already running thin. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm sure we're all eager to get started with the financials. I, don't believe we were expecting additional participants today," Lawrence said, the words coming out just a little too smoothly to hide his discomfort. His voice was laced with the subtle condescension that came naturally to men of his stature in a room full of wealth and prestige. Sophia raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a slight smirk. She knew exactly what was going on in Lawrence's mind and the minds of the other executives. They were all wondering the same thing. Why had she brought a janitor to a meeting that could potentially shape the future of Hanley Enterprises? She calmly held up her hand to silence him before he could continue. "I invited him because I value insight, and not just the kind that comes with an expensive degree or a tailored suit. Daniel has been with this company for many years, and his perspective is invaluable." She glanced over at Daniel, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him. He had spent his entire career moving in the shadows of corporate giants, never once given the opportunity to voice an opinion in rooms like this. But today was different. He had seen enough over the years to know what was wrong with the company's approach, its inefficiencies, its failures to adapt, and its disregard for the very systems that kept the company running. Sophia knew what she was doing. She had invited Daniel for a reason. He may not wear the finest clothes or speak with the same polished language as the men in the room, but his knowledge and practical approach to business outshone many of the so-called experts around this table. And as she glanced around at the executives, she knew that they would soon come to realize just how much they had underestimated him. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice unwavering. "You may not understand why Daniel is here, but I do. The question is, are you ready to listen?" The room fell into a tense silence once more. The executives exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't how business meetings were supposed to go. But Sophia wasn't concerned with how things were supposed to be. She was concerned with what needed to be done. As the silence stretched on, Daniel shifted on his feet. This was it, the moment where he could either step forward or shrink back. He cleared his throat and straightened his back, ready to speak, not as a janitor but as someone with something to offer. Today, he wasn't invisible. And today, he wasn't about to let anyone forget that. The silence in the room was thick with curiosity and skepticism, as the high-powered executives of Hanley Enterprises exchanged silent glances, unsure of what to make of the woman seated at the head of the table, Sophia Reynolds, and her unexpected companion. The janitor, Daniel, still standing awkwardly near the back of the room, was an anomaly in this corporate space, and the tension was palpable. But Sophia wasn't rattled. She had a plan, and she was about to make sure everyone in this room understood why Daniel mattered. She took a breath, straightened her back, and with a calm, authoritative voice, addressed the room. "Gentlemen," she began, her tone crisp but not unkind, "I know many of you are wondering why I've brought Daniel into this meeting today. Let me make it clear, this isn't a mistake, and he's not just here for show." Sophia's words hung in the air like a challenge. The executives sat up straighter, exchanging looks that ranged from mild confusion to outright disbelief. A janitor, an employee so far removed from the power structures of Hanley Enterprises, wasn't supposed to be in this room. And yet, here he was, standing quietly by her side as if he belonged just as much as any board member. The CEO, who had spent years building his empire and keeping his seat at the table, cleared his throat, trying to mask his discomfort. He glanced at Daniel before redirecting his attention to Sophia. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm not sure I understand. We're about to discuss some critical financial strategies." "Are you saying that?" he began, but Sophia raised her hand to silence him. "I am saying that this man—" Sophia's gaze shifted toward Daniel, who was now standing with his arms crossed, eyes focused straight ahead, "has invaluable insights that could help us improve this company. Daniel isn't just the janitor in the hallway you've all ignored. He's someone who has been watching, listening, and thinking about how we can do better. And that's why he's here today." The room grew even quieter, and the executives exchanged uneasy glances. The CFO, Lawrence Whitman, opened his mouth to speak but paused, his eyebrows furrowed. He wasn't quite sure how to respond, but his skepticism was written all over his face. "I'm afraid I don't quite see how a janitor could have the insight we need for these high-level discussions. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar strategy here." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concerns, Lawrence. I too was skeptical at first. But you see, it wasn't until a few weeks ago that I realized how much Daniel knows about business, specifically, how much he knows about our business." The executives leaned in, intrigued despite themselves. They weren't used to being told something like this by someone of Sophia's stature. They had expected a presentation filled with the usual jargon about profits, losses, and growth projections. But instead, they were being forced to confront something far more unexpected, the possibility that someone without a college degree, without any professional titles, could possess the kind of knowledge they had spent years cultivating. Sophia continued, her eyes scanning the room as she spoke. "A few weeks ago, I happened to pass by the staff break room, a place I don't frequent often. But that day, I overheard something that made me stop in my tracks. Daniel was speaking with another janitor about the stock market. It wasn't small talk. It was about long-term market trends, how certain businesses were poised to outperform others, how to identify undervalued assets, and the mistakes that many in the industry were making when they followed outdated financial models." The executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Lawrence, in particular, looked like he had bitten down on something sour, his lips pressed into a thin line. "And you're saying you overheard this conversation and decided he should be part of our meeting today?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Sophia's smile remained cool and composed. "Yes, I did. Because what Daniel said that day resonated with me. His perspectives weren't clouded by corporate buzzwords or market jargon. He spoke in terms I understood, terms that made sense, and more importantly, terms that no one else in this company seems to be considering." Daniel stood silently beside her as the executives absorbed the weight of her words. The room was heavy with silence now, as the reality of the situation began to settle in. How could a janitor, an employee usually overlooked by everyone in this room, know more about strategy than they did? And yet, here they were, listening to Sophia speak about him with such confidence. As the room grew tense, Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He had always been content to go unnoticed, to clean the floors, to sweep up the trash, to make sure everything was tidy while the suits made the decisions. But today was different. Sophia motioned to him. "Daniel, why don't you share what you told me that day?" she asked, her tone still calm but imbued with an underlying confidence. "Let them hear your thoughts." The room fell into an almost reverential silence as Daniel finally stepped forward. His nervousness was evident. His hands fidgeted with the rag in his hand, his eyes darting briefly to the floor before locking with Sophia's. She had faith in him, and that gave him the courage he needed. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "I'm not a financial expert," he said quietly, "but I've been around long enough to see patterns. And what I've noticed with this company is that we're not evaluating our assets in the right way. We're focusing on what we have right now, rather than what we could have in the future." A few of the executives looked skeptical, exchanging side glances, but Daniel continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "The real money in our company isn't just in the assets we own today, it's in how we use them. If we start focusing on potential growth, on undervalued assets, we can turn this company around in ways no one here has considered." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I read the reports and I see what's missing. We're throwing away money on logistics and outsourcing, but we have the infrastructure to handle it ourselves. If we just optimize internally, we could save millions." Sophia watched as the room fell into stunned silence. Daniel had made a point that even the most seasoned executives had failed to see. And in that moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The executives who had once dismissed him as just a janitor now had no choice but to listen. Sophia leaned back in her chair, a subtle smile curling at the corner of her lips. She had known all along that Daniel's insights would prove invaluable. She had also known that the executives needed a reality check, one that would force them to look beyond the surface and see the true potential in someone like Daniel. As the room continued to process his words, it became clear, today wasn't just about presenting a strategy. It was about challenging the status quo, about recognizing that talent didn't always come in the form of a fancy degree or an expensive suit. Today, the janitor had proven that he belonged in this room just as much as anyone else. And the room, no, the entire company, would never be the same again. The room was quiet, so quiet that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed too loud. Marcus, the janitor who had been dismissed as nothing more than an outsider just moments earlier, was now standing at the head of the table, confidently discussing strategies that had the potential to save Hanley Enterprises millions of dollars. His voice was steady, his words clear, and every executive in the room was hanging on his every sentence. He started by pointing out the company's over-reliance on outdated models for evaluating their assets. "You're looking at the immediate value of your assets," Marcus explained, "but you're not considering their future potential. In business, especially in times of change, you need to understand where things are going, not where they've been." The executives, many of whom had spent years honing their craft in the highest business schools and corporate boardrooms, exchanged glances. For some, it was still hard to believe that a janitor, someone who didn't even belong in this space, was delivering insights they hadn't heard before. Lawrence Whitman, the CFO, was the first to speak up. He leaned forward in his chair, arms crossed, his face skeptical. "I don't mean to be rude, Marcus, but we've seen these projections. We know the market trends. How exactly do you propose we rethink our approach?" His tone was condescending, as though he expected Marcus to falter. Marcus didn't miss a beat. His response was simple but firm. "You've missed the bigger picture. You're using outdated data to justify your strategies. The market has changed. The assumptions you're making are based on old models. Right now, the real money is in underutilized resources, not the assets you've been investing in." The CFO blinked, clearly taken aback. Lawrence opened his mouth, but no words came out. The other executives sat in stunned silence as Marcus continued, undeterred by their skepticism. You're bleeding money because you're outsourcing too much. You're paying for services you can handle internally. Have you even looked at your logistics division's performance? I bet it's underperforming compared to your projections. Marcus turned towards the wall-mounted screen, where the company's financial figures were being displayed. He pointed at a chart showing the outsourcing costs over the past few quarters. In Q3 alone, you spent 12% more on outsourcing than you needed to. And at the same time, your internal fleet capacity is operating at less than 50%. You're paying premium prices for services you already have the infrastructure to manage. You need to optimize your operations internally. The room went completely still. It was as though time had frozen. The board members, who had been arrogantly waiting for Marcus to stumble, were now realizing something they hadn't wanted to admit. He was making sense. Martin Caldwell, one of the senior executives, shifted in his seat, his expression no longer filled with smug disbelief, but with something closer to curiosity. He adjusted his tie nervously and leaned in, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "And how exactly would you restructure this model, Marcus?" he asked. Marcus didn't flinch. His voice was calm, but there was a steel-like edge to his words. "It's simple. Cut outsourcing by 30%. Restructure your distribution model. You already have the resources internally to meet demand, so stop paying top dollar to companies that don't offer you the best value. And then reinvest that savings into improving your current infrastructure, making it more efficient and cost-effective." Lawrence, who had spent years as the company's chief financial officer, now seemed completely out of his depth. He rubbed his temples, clearly not used to someone challenging his established mindset so directly. "You can't just restructure an entire logistics division overnight," he argued, his voice tight with tension. "The numbers you're suggesting," Marcus interrupted him, his voice firm yet polite. "I read your reports, and your models, Lawrence, they're outdated. You haven't accounted for the market shifts over the past 3 years. It's not about restructuring overnight. It's about recognizing inefficiencies and addressing them strategically." For a brief moment, the room was silent. The other executives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly rattled. But it wasn't until Sophia Reynolds, the woman who had brought Marcus into this room, spoke up that the full gravity of the situation became clear. "He's right," Sophia said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I've been listening to Marcus. He's not just a janitor. He's someone who sees patterns, connects dots, and understands business in a way that you all haven't considered." Marcus turned to face Sophia, his expression unreadable. There was something deeply satisfying about hearing her back him up. It was more than just a professional endorsement. It was a validation of everything he had worked for, all the hours spent reading financial reports in the janitor's closet, soaking in knowledge that he had never been given the opportunity to act on. Martin Caldwell, the senior executive who had seemed so confident earlier, now looked shaken. "Are we really considering taking financial advice from someone who doesn't even have a degree?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Sophia smiled coldly. "You're missing the point, Martin. Degrees don't define intelligence. Results do. Marcus may not have a fancy title, but he has proven something today. He knows how to find solutions when others can't." The room was beginning to shift, and it was clear that the executives were no longer dismissing Marcus as just a janitor. Instead, they were listening, really listening. And what they were hearing was a completely new perspective. Finally, Lawrence Whitman, the CFO, let out a long breath and sat back in his chair. "So you're saying that if we follow these suggestions, we could save millions?" Marcus nodded confidently. "Yes. And more than that, you'll set this company on a path toward long-term profitability. You need to stop looking at the bottom line as a quick fix and start thinking about the long-term sustainability of this company. A few executives began murmuring amongst themselves, exchanging calculations and notes. It was clear that Marcus had hit a nerve, and for the first time in this meeting there was a sense of possibility in the air. They might have underestimated him, all of them had, but now they were starting to realize that they might have been wrong. Sophia looked around the room, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I think we've all heard enough. Let's move forward with the plan Marcus outlined. We'll give him the opportunity to lead the restructuring efforts, and we'll make sure we hold ourselves accountable for the changes we need to make." As the room fell into deep discussion, Marcus exhaled deeply. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. Today, he had proven that anyone, no matter their background, could make a difference. And as the executives slowly began to discuss the implementation of his strategies, Marcus knew that his future at Hanley Enterprises was about to change forever. But more importantly, this was a turning point for the company. The culture of elitism and status that had kept people like him invisible was being replaced with a culture of inclusivity and meritocracy, where the value of ideas mattered more than the title you held. And that was just the beginning. The boardroom, which had just been shaken by Marcus's insightful presentation, now fell into an eerie silence. The executives, who had been so sure of their expertise, sat in stunned disbelief, still grappling with the knowledge that a janitor had just shown them a way to save millions and transform the company's operations. The air was thick with uncertainty, as the powerful, high-ranking individuals who had been so confident in their positions now had to reckon with the fact that they had been wrong. Sophia, sitting calmly at the head of the table, waited for the room to quiet down before speaking. Her eyes scanned the boardroom, reading the room carefully. There was no rush in her voice, no hurry to make her point. She leaned forward slightly, taking in the looks of shock and disbelief from the board members. The time had come to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. She cleared her throat softly, and as if the tension in the air could no longer be ignored, she addressed the executives directly. "I'm sure you're all wondering why Marcus is here today," she began, her voice steady and composed, a stark contrast to the nervous energy rippling through the room. "The truth is, I've been watching him for a long time. He's not just some janitor who happens to know a few things about finances. Marcus has been a source of insight for me, and for this company, for months now." The words hung in the air like a weighty revelation. The executives shifted in their seats, glancing at one another in surprise, their earlier dismissiveness of Marcus now giving way to a deeper curiosity. They had underestimated him. They had written him off because of his uniform, but now they were beginning to realize they had no idea who they were dealing with. Sophia continued, her gaze unwavering. "I am the daughter of the late chairman, Charles Hanley. I've inherited this company, and as its new leader, I've been keeping a close eye on the state of things. But what I've learned from Marcus, what he's taught me about the inefficiencies, the gaps in our strategy, is far more valuable than any textbook I could have read. He's not just here because I brought him. He's here because he earned the right to be." The executives, already shocked by Marcus's intelligence, were now faced with the revelation that Sophia, the woman in charge, had been quietly observing Marcus all this time. Their disbelief morphed into something else, admiration mixed with a growing sense of discomfort. The woman they had assumed would lead like the rest of them had made a decision that was unconventional, and to them, highly unorthodox. Sophia's words were both a challenge and an invitation. "I want you all to think about something," she said, her eyes meeting each of theirs. "For months, you've been struggling with problems that Marcus has already solved. He's not just a janitor. He's someone who has a deep understanding of this company, its weaknesses, and its strengths. He sees what you couldn't, and he's shown us how to fix it." The room was dead silent now. Sophia's revelation had turned the entire meeting on its head. The executives, many of whom had spent decades building their careers on their expertise, now had to come to terms with the fact that someone who didn't have their title, didn't have their background, had outsmarted them. This wasn't just about a few cost-saving strategies anymore. It was about their entire worldview being challenged. Sophia took a breath before speaking again, her voice filled with quiet authority. "Because of everything Marcus has done for this company already, I'm offering him a position. He will join us as our new financial consultant, effective immediately." The boardroom seemed to hold its breath. Marcus, who had been standing at the back of the room, his hand still gripping the cleaning rag like a reminder of his past, looked up in shock. His mind raced as he processed the enormity of the moment. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was a complete transformation of his life. The janitor, who had been cleaning floors just hours ago, was now being offered a role at the heart of the company. The executives, however, were still reeling from the revelation. Martin Caldwell, a senior vice president who had been one of the most dismissive of Marcus, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He shot a glance at Lawrence, the CFO, who had been the most vocal about rejecting Marcus's insights. The discomfort in the room was palpable as they tried to process the turn of events. Finally, Lawrence spoke, his voice laced with disbelief. "This is a joke, right? You can't just hire a janitor to be a financial consultant. This isn't how things are done." Sophia's eyes hardened, her voice sharp and unwavering. "No, Lawrence, this is exactly how things should be done. You see, business isn't about titles or the number of degrees you hold. It's about seeing potential, recognizing talent when it's right in front of you, and making the decisions that will actually move us forward." Marcus, still standing by the door, was now at the center of the conversation. His heart raced in his chest, and he couldn't believe what was happening. He had never imagined this moment would come. The same room that had judged him, dismissed him, and looked past him now had no choice but to listen. Martin, visibly flustered, stood up. "I don't care if you're the chairman's daughter. This is absurd," he spat. "You can't possibly think that a man who cleans floors can solve our financial problems." Sophia didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to understand, Martin. I'm telling you that I've made my decision. Marcus is here to stay, whether you accept it or not." The room grew quieter as the weight of her words settled. Alyssa Chen, a junior executive who had been quietly observing, was the first to speak up. I think this could work. If Marcus has the insights, then maybe we should give him a chance." Sophia nodded, her voice softer now. "Exactly. Marcus has a perspective none of you have. His success won't come from your legacy or the titles you've held. It will come from his ability to see things as they are and fix what you couldn't." The tension in the room was palpable, but as the executives looked around, they saw no support for their previous stance. The power dynamic had shifted. Marcus wasn't the outsider anymore. He had earned a seat at the table. Sophia leaned back in her chair, smiling to herself. "We'll need to rework the agenda, of course, but Marcus will be our lead consultant on the financial restructuring. And I trust he'll do a better job than any of us here." The board was stunned into silence. This wasn't just a hiring decision. It was a cultural shift, a realization that what they had thought was the key to success, titles, degrees, connections, wasn't the answer at all. What truly mattered was vision, action, and merit. Sophia's voice broke the silence. "If anyone here has a problem with that, speak up now." No one did. She looked at Marcus, giving him a slight nod, signaling that it was time to take the next step in this new era for Hanley Enterprises. The game had changed. In the days following Marcus's groundbreaking revelation in the boardroom, Hanley Enterprises began to undergo a transformation that no one could have anticipated. What had once been a stifling, conservative corporate environment was gradually becoming a space open to new ideas, unconventional solutions, and a newfound sense of equality. Marcus, now in his new role as the company's financial consultant, quickly began to implement the strategies he had proposed, making immediate changes that would set the company on a path to financial recovery. Sophia, who had been the catalyst for this shift, worked closely with Marcus, providing him with the resources and authority to make decisions that affected every level of the company. Together, they began to untangle the inefficiencies that had been bogging down Hanley Enterprises for years. The most significant changes came from Marcus's financial restructuring plans. His ability to look at the company's assets and liabilities from a fresh perspective allowed him to pinpoint areas of waste and mismanagement that had gone unnoticed by the previous leadership. At first, many of the executives still struggled to accept the idea of Marcus as a legitimate figure within the company. They were used to a corporate hierarchy where authority came with fancy degrees, business suits, and years of experience in the field. Marcus, on the other hand, had neither of those things. He had never been part of the boardroom culture. He had never been part of the world of high-end suits or meetings in polished glass towers. But his ideas, based on years of careful observation, a deep understanding of market dynamics, and the practical financial knowledge that had come from watching his father's small business thrive, were undeniable. As Marcus began to implement his changes, he focused on streamlining the company's operations, eliminating unnecessary outsourcing contracts, optimizing internal teams, and identifying areas where the company could save millions. His approach was methodical but efficient, tackling one issue at a time, ensuring that each decision was grounded in reality rather than corporate theories. The results came quickly. Within the first quarter, the company saw a significant reduction in costs, with a newfound focus on growth rather than simply holding on to the past. At first, the executives were reluctant to give Marcus credit. They were still trapped in their old mindset, seeing him as someone who had come from nowhere, someone who shouldn't be in their world. But as they watched the company's financial health improve and realized that Marcus's strategies were actually working, the resistance began to dissipate. Slowly but surely, the corporate culture started to shift. Those who had once been skeptical started to see the value in Marcus's ideas. They began to appreciate the fact that he didn't need a title, a degree, or years of corporate experience to identify problems and come up with practical solutions. The change wasn't just happening in the boardroom, it was happening throughout the company. The employees, the janitors, the office assistants, the analysts began to see the difference too. There was a new sense of empowerment. People started to feel heard, valued, and respected for the ideas and insights they could contribute, regardless of their position or background. Sophia's decision to bring Marcus in had set off a chain reaction, one that was changing the entire culture of Hanley Enterprises from top to bottom. As Marcus walked the hallways now, his uniform no longer defined him. People no longer saw him as just a janitor. They saw him as a leader, someone who had brought about real change, someone whose ideas and insights were worthy of respect. He had proven, without a doubt, that the ability to lead didn't come from titles but from the ability to see things others couldn't and act accordingly. Meanwhile, Sophia, who had quietly observed Marcus's journey, saw a transformation in him too. The man who had walked into that boardroom unsure of his place in the world had now become a key player in the company's revival. She had watched as he went from being an invisible figure in the background to a respected advisor whose insights had shaped the future of Hanley Enterprises. The shift in Marcus's life mirrored the shift in the company. Both had been overlooked, both had been underestimated, and both were now thriving. The executives who had once dismissed Marcus were now asking for his advice. They sought his opinion on financial matters, on market trends, and even on the company's culture. They had learned, in the most unexpected way, that true leadership didn't come from the surface-level things, such as resumes, degrees, and titles, but from a person's ability to understand what needed to be done and how to make it happen. As the company moved forward under this new, inclusive mindset, Marcus and Sophia continued to lead Hanley Enterprises into its next chapter. The progress they made together wasn't just about profit margins and growth. It was about a cultural renaissance, one that would encourage employees at every level to think critically, share their ideas, and know that their voices mattered. The room full of executives who had once looked down on Marcus had learned a valuable lesson. True value is not always found in the titles people hold, but in their ability to recognize problems and offer solutions, no matter where they come from. As the weeks passed and the company's growth continued, Sophia and Marcus both knew that the real work was just beginning. They had only scratched the surface of what Hanley Enterprises could be, but with the lessons they had learned about value, merit, and inclusion, they were ready for whatever came next. And so Hanley Enterprises, a company once stuck in its outdated ways, had entered a new era, one where true talent, no matter the background, would always be seen, valued, and given the chance to lead.